When I first started raised bed gardening, I went straight for this drip irrigation that you can see in the raised bed behind me, except I was never really pleased with how it looks. Maybe that's what's holding you back from getting into raised bed gardening. Maybe you're looking for a more discreet, maybe a completely invisible watering solution. It's taken me a couple years to get here, but let me share with you 3 options that I've figured out that work and that are completely invisible for watering your raised bed. Let's get into it. What I have right behind me is the first option I want to share, and that is a self-watering raised bed. Now, a raised bed, if you're unfamiliar with it, has no bottom. But on this one, there's technically a bottom that includes a water reservoir and self-watering wicking cells. This is a 17-inch tall 9-in-1 Vigo Garden raised bed in the color olive green, but inside there's self-watering reservoirs and wicking cells. What I did was I purchased the 2-foot by 8-foot configuration of Vigo Garden's self-watering wicking cell inserts. I started first by assembling the raised bed, and then at the bottom of the raised bed I placed 4 water reservoirs, and then on top of that I placed the 4 wicking cells. And then once you have that assembled, what you can do is put the corner pieces so it's nearly watertight. I say nearly because if I really overfill it, I can see drainage coming out the sides. So be mindful of that if you're thinking about putting it on a patio or something. The way that the self-watering wicking cell technology works is there's a reservoir at the bottom and then you have wicking cells on top. The wicking cells, you're supposed to push the soil into the wicking cells, and those wicking cells have slits or holes in them so that the water will touch the soil. Through capillary action, that water will move upwards into the soil, bringing water right to the roots of your plants. When I first bought it and first installed it, I thought that the roots really needed to reach all the way down into the reservoir, but it's not the case. The capillary action really does work quite well in the soil. So even if you have shallow roots from fresh transplants or really young direct sowed seedlings, they're still going to get the water they need because the soil is going to be at this moisture level that's right for the plants. Now there's different ones on the market. Let me talk about maybe some of the disadvantages of this particular setup that I have. The way that you fill it up is you just take your hose and you are watering the soil from the top. Any excess water is going to drain down. It's going to travel all the way through the soil and down into the reservoir. And there is no gauge, so you can't tell if the water reservoir is full or empty. I normally will use this moisture meter that I purchased on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description box below, but this lets me know if the soil is dry, moist, or too wet. What I do is I put it in the soil and I let it stabilize for a minute or 2, and that's how I know if it's time to water or not. Some other ones on the market might actually have a gauge. So if you're shopping for self-watering raised beds, think about whether you want a built-in gauge or if you're okay with using a moisture meter to accomplish the same goal. Another thing you might want to be mindful of when purchasing a setup like this, where it's a raised bed with self-watering inserts, is think about whether you want that reservoir to really fill the space on the bottom or not. I've seen some setups where it's like a cell here and a cell here and there's space in between, and so when you're watering it you would have to be maybe a little more intentional about where you put your hose, and you would have far more leakage than I do on this one. Now once you get into a product that has a fully sealed bottom, it's technically called a planter. So I want to introduce you to this one from Crescent Garden. This is called the slat rectangular box, and it has the True Drop technology where it is a self-watering planter. It has that built-in reservoir, it has a port for you to pour the water in on the side, and it has a gauge for you to tell when it's time to water. It does seem to be quite a bit more expensive than the Vigo Garden option. So this is the Vigo Garden self-watering wicking cell setup, and it does work and it's completely invisible. A watering olla is the next option. A watering olla is a clay pot that you bury underneath the soil, and then it typically has a silicone lid that you can open up to fill the clay pot with water. Then you cover it up, and because the terracotta clay that the pot is made out of is porous, the water will actually leak out of the clay pot at a very slow rate and keep that soil moist. The plant roots even will gravitate towards the clay pot and grow to even attach to the clay pot itself. It's a very discreet option, and it's actually very convenient. One of the things I love about ollas versus a self-watering raised bed is the fact that I can tell when it's full or when it's empty. All I gotta do is open it up, put my finger in there, see if it needs more water or not, and then I can add the water and see when it reaches the top of the reservoir. Now, I've only used this in a planter type setting, but I'm gonna link to a video in the description box below to another YouTuber named Bree Ellis, who actually uses ollas all over her raised bed in her backyard garden. They're extremely effective, and they're also 25% off right now with the Black Friday sale. So I'll put a link to that in the description box below as well. When choosing an olla, you're also going to want to know the space that you're going to put it in so that you can choose the right size olla. What I have here is a small size olla from Grow Olla, so it has the blue top, but there's a size chart that goes along with these ollas. I believe the small waters up to a 2-foot radius, the medium waters up to a 3-foot radius, and the large size waters up to a 4-foot radius. So if I were to do ollas in my 2-foot by 8-foot raised bed, I might do 2 large ones in the whole raised bed, or I might do 4 size smalls in the raised bed. There's 2 downsides that I see with an olla. The first one is the space that it takes up underneath the soil. So you may choose not to put your root veggies right next to the olla. Something like a tomato plant right next to it would do really well. When I planted potatoes last year, I used a planter and an olla, and it worked really well, except I do believe that the olla actually contributed to the space constraints that the potatoes felt, and probably contributed to the small size of the potatoes. So in that case, it would have been better for me to use a self-watering planter. The other downside isn't much of a downside for me just because I live in a warm zone 10A Florida, but if you lived in an area where it does freeze, they always recommend pulling up your ollas and emptying them before a frost comes. And that's just because that terracotta clay will crack and it will break if it goes through a frost. Subsurface drip irrigation is my third option. I'm using it in my strawberry tower right behind me. So subsurface drip irrigation is probably going to require the most upfront work. But the advantage is it's running water, it's on a timed system, so you barely have to touch it up, except at the very beginning when you're trying to fine tune like how long you need to run it for. But if you go through that upfront effort to install a subsurface drip irrigation system, you could be almost free from watering your plants. If we look in one of the pockets of the garden tower, you can see this brown hose. This hose has emitters, so when the water's turned on, water will slowly drip out of these at a predetermined rate, which is usually on the label. For me, I think it's 0.5 gallons per hour, and I have a emitter spacing of every 12 inches on this line. There's different options available for the emitter spacing. I think most commonly it's 12 inches or 6 inches. The advantage to this stuff is that it can be buried. Now, I haven't used it in a raised bed setting, but there's no reason it couldn't be applied in that scenario as well. I've done it in this garden tower where there's soil all the way throughout, and I decided to spiral that emitter line all the way up the garden tower, so it's buried throughout the garden tower. Now let's talk about the difficulty with setting this up. Now this is the front of my raised bed, and you can see this PVC is coming up through the soil on the inside of the raised bed. I could have moved this to the back side of the raised bed and it would have been a little bit more discreet. You also can see how I have it sticking up a good like 4 inches. I could have cut this PVC pipe and put it really, really low, like right on top of the surface. And I do think you would still need a portion of it on top of the surface because you might want a shut-off valve to be able to shut off the water supply to your individual raised bed. And then you might still need your head assembly if you don't have it installed otherwise in your system. So this is a filter and a backflow preventer and a pressure regulator, all of which you need for a drip irrigation system. I'll link to a video right here about how I routed the water supply all the way out here. And then if you look right here, this is the pressure regulator, and this is an adapter between the 3/4 inch hose thread to a 1/2 inch poly tubing, and this is your 1/2 inch poly tubing, which is typically used for a main line for drip irrigation. If I was trying to make this truly invisible, I would just take this 1/2 inch poly tube, put an end cap, then I would use a barbed coupling to connect some of that 1/4 inch emitter tubing, and you could actually bury that line. This option is definitely the most amount of work to set up initially, but one of the main advantages of drip irrigation is that it's slow, deep watering. So it will help your plants grow really strong roots, and it's also a very efficient way to water as long as you don't run your system too long. I hope this video gives you some ideas about how you could do watering in your raised beds in a neat or discreet or completely invisible way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.